Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi argued that populism in the United States is a threat to democracy at an Oxford Union debate. Let's take a listen.
So money and populism, sadly, have gone together with this ethno-nationalist what they call elite, which we call education, free press, and the rest. So I urge you to think in terms of the word. It says it's a threat. You're going to deny that it's a threat to democracy in the versions that have emerged?
Pelosi, who was also invited to deliver a lecture at Oxford Union, went on to say, quote, "Poor souls who are looking for some answers are refusing to accept options Democrats put forward due to their beliefs about guns, gays, and God." On the other side of the debate was Winston Marshall, a musician who was once part of the popular band Mumford & Sons and now hosts a podcast for The Spectator. He argued that the word populist has been changed by elites who have failed to align with their own narrative.
The threat to democracy comes from those who write off ordinary people as deplorable. The threat to democracy comes from those who smear working people as racist. The threat to democracy comes from those who write off working people as populist.
The former musician added that he was surprised by Pelosi's argument, given he thought the left was supposed to be anti-elite and anti-establishment. Marshall also took aim at social media companies and the mainstream media. The Oxford Union motion, titled "This House Believes Populism is a Threat to Democracy," was ultimately passed with a vote of 177 to 168. He later tweeted that Pelosi won the room, but that he won the internet. It did strike me as an interesting kind of form and choice of candidates to debate populism. Nancy Pelosi's kind of wealth and privilege needs no introduction. But Winston Marshall also comes from what's described as a genteel European family on the internet. His grandmother was a real estate tycoon of some kind. So it does seem to me frustrating that working class people are never invited to the platform to actually discuss themselves, are always just debated in the third person. But what did you make of this debate?
Well, it was a little bit abstract. I think the thing being debated was literally, is populism a threat to democracy? I'm surprised. I mean, that Nancy Pelosi won with that framing. It would. Like, there are things you can say about populism that are bad. I don't know that threat to democracy in terms of like just what the masses want. Right, democracy is what the masses want. Now you can say, framing. Obviously there are things like in America, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, that we don't put up to a vote. We long ago decided there should be rules to stop, even if a majority of people want this kind of speech or this kind of expression made illegal, we're not going to do that. It doesn't matter even if it's unpopular, and we've really tried to litigate that over a period of time to make sure those rules are as ironclad as they can be, even though they come under attack all the time. So I think it'd be fine to say, I would even agree with if the proposition was populism can be a threat to individual rights or individual liberty, but populism as a threat to democracy seems a very, pure and direct democracy is, not a form of government that we actually have in America or that I would actually support, because there are some things that should not be, we would disagree over what those things are, but most people would agree some things don't just get put to a majority vote. So that's a kind of weird framing, right?
So what Marshall was getting at is this idea that after the Trump era, there was a deliberate attempt to conflate the word populism or the idea of populism with Trumpism and some of the cultural attitudes that kind of the MAGA movement embraced, whether it is a less tolerant attitude toward people who are LGBTQ, some of the racialized statements that Trump has made about what kind of people deserve to immigrate to the country and who's a very fine person and who's not sending their best, and the like. And this was not just aimed at Donald Trump. This started in 2016. It was very much aimed at Bernie Sanders. So one of the points that Marshall made in the course of this debate was to say that before this era, someone like Barack Obama used to speak approvingly of Bernie Sanders and himself as fellow populists against the elites. As populism started to get associated with something that was going to attract a lot of positive attention and hurt the chances of establishment Democrats like Hillary Clinton, then we get both Donald Trump's populism and Bernie Sanders' populism criticized as akin to racism, bigotry, homophobia. And I think that there certainly is a legitimate argument for those things being a feature of a kind of conservative populism, at least the kind that Donald Trump has chosen to run with. It certainly was not true of Bernie Sanders. And I would agree with Marshall insofar as that conflation of populism as necessarily culturally conservative is not accurate. But it is also true that I think part of the reason that Nancy Pelosi might win in a room like this is that people are so turned off by the cultural conservatism that Marshall, in fact, does seem to embrace. He opened his remarks with a comment about trans women, for example, that wasn't especially kind or flattering, that the room might basically continue to do what liberals have hoped that they would do, which is to be anti-populist because they think that to be anti-bigoted, you have to be anti-populist, which I think is a real harm being done to the populist movement by liberals who don't want populism to succeed because he's right, they are not populists.
Well, right, and some things that liberals or progressive want are more popular than others. The economic policies of a progressive wing of the Democratic Party are, I don't agree with these policies or a lot of these policies, but they poll well. But the people remain, public sentiment is far more in favor of restrictions on immigration, for instance, than the elites are in society. So even though that clashes with, what progressive Democrats want. So like some things you want are popular, some things they are not. The job of explaining to the voter, convincing the voters that your set of policies would be better or that they should change their mind about that, that's just the work of running a campaign and running elections, and you have to try to do that. And it's just a weird framing that that's what happens in a democracy. Opinion polling on issues changes over time. Obviously, support for instance, in our lifetime, support for gay marriage increased dramatically over time as people made that argument, and that's fine. And now maybe it's come down a little bit from, I think, associations with the transgender debate, where again there's a tremendous popular sentiment that at least some of the excesses in women's sports and so on, those kinds of things are very, very unpopular. What people like maybe Nancy Pelosi want to do on those issues.
I think the problem is historically we have had a very rich populist political culture in the United States of America, centered in places that we no longer think of as particularly progressive because we think of progressivism as culturally progressive and coastal, as opposed to places like Kansas and Wisconsin, where we historically have had more populist, socialists, people who are deeply economically populist, be successful in an electoral context. Thomas Frank has written about this in What's the Matter with Kansas and Listen Liberal, and the people know all great histories of American populism and how American neoliberalism and these corporatized movements have worked to crush that and to smear populism in the exact kind of ways as being described here, as associated with a kind of cultural conservatism, which most people don't prioritize over their economic well-being unless they're pushed to do so, again, by two corporate political parties, neither of whom really wants to engage in economic populism, but plays one side off of the other by basically framing their entire political ideology around cultural issues. So I would say to be distrustful of folks who are leading with the cultural stuff, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, and ask yourself the question of why it is that when someone like Bernie Sanders comes to the foreground, who isn't really emphasizing cultural politics, he's the guy who emphasizes Medicare for all, a wealth tax, the kind of broadly popular policies that most people agree on because they're about economic populism, the kind of things that will actually impact their lives, rather than thinking about whether or not I want a middle school student in Utah to be able to play on some soccer team somewhere. That becomes very popular. How do you kill a movement like that? Well, I think that Winston is right, that people like Barack Obama flipped to start saying, well, populism is authoritarianism, populism is bigotry, populism is all these other things, because they know that if the people figure it out, that most people agree on most things when it comes to their pocketbook and how they want the country to be structured economically, then both the Democratic Party and the corporate Republican Party wouldn't have a chance in heck.
It's related to this, something that happened last week. An organization, a well-known conservative activist organization called FreedomWorks, actually ended itself, that is dissolving, it's done. It's existed since the Tea Party days, since 2010, and really represented, is part of a trend of this time period of the Tea Party movement, which was kind of an attempt to be, even though we didn't so much use the word populist on the right at the time, but was like a marriage of a right libertarianism and populism to see if that could even be a successful marriage, and was for a time, in the age of generating tremendous support on the right for, or not support, opposition to Barack Obama's policies, spending too much, tax too much, all that kind of stuff, that really did break when Donald Trump entered the scene and was, famously did not want to cut entitlements, was waffling on whether he wanted to change Obamacare or leave it in place, really did break apart the Tea Party movement, because then a lot of the organizations like Freedom Works were actually not happy with the economic policies that Trump represented, but their donors and supporters loved Trump. And so they'd have people, and this is all like in the kind of retrospectives for this organization, the people associated with it are admitting this. Like, we would have donors who hated that we were not getting more on board with Trump, and we'd have people who were furious that we said too many nice things about Trump, because they didn't, they were very principled, limited government people who thought Trump was not good on those issues. So it just became an impossible, and this has been a problem on the right, a marriage that had to end.
Yeah, look, I think that the irony as a Bernie supporter in 2016 and someone who obviously worked for his 2020 campaign is that for all of the hand-wringing liberals do about how they are struggling to defeat populism, by which they mean MAGA right populism, and how Trump is a threat to democracy, the antidote, obviously, was left populism. You saw Bernie come out of nowhere in 2016 as someone who did not think he was running a real campaign to win almost half of the states in the Democratic primary contest, despite the blackouts, despite all of the institutional barriers to him doing so. And it was no coincidence that both Trump and Bernie were rising up on the national stage at the exact same time. But just like you're seeing right now that the Democratic Party would rather lose an election than change course on Gaza, the Democratic Party would rather lose that election with a historically unpopular candidate in Hillary Clinton than simply do what the people want them to do and embrace left populism, which is the antidote. And I think
many Republicans would also rather lose an election than part ways with a historically unpopular candidate.
But Bernie Sanders was, in both elections, the best candidate that performed best with independent voters. Yeah. He was that magical quality that manages to get a lot of people from the right. There was this classic like Obama, Bernie to Trump voter, right? Yeah. That confounded newspaper journalists, but makes a lot of sense to people who actually talk about populism and understand what's motivating voters. So when you hear people like Chuck Schumer say we're going to pick up some soccer mom in Connecticut who has conservative fiscal policy, but likes her kids' gay friends, okay, that's like two people in America. That's not actually representative. They refuse to go after people who might have some weird racial views, but we're willing to vote for Obama. We're willing to vote for Jewish Bernie Sanders, but then we're ultimately falling into Trump.
I agree with you that Sanders had the clearest appeal to those kinds of people. Biden did a better job with those kinds of people than Hillary did, for sure, which is why he won the election. But that was last time.
Populist vibes. I'm going to put a hard hat on. I can dap a guy up in the factory. But again, it's identity politics. Liberals only know how to do this kind of superficial vibe of, I like working class people, I like black people, I like Hispanic people, I like gay people. It's not real, it's not material. And the core populism is actually delivering on some material, fiscal, financial, economic basis for the working class. It's a group that is defined by their economic relationship to each other, the working class, not by their identity, their non-financial identity characteristics. And that's why the Democrats continue to fail.
More Rising right after this.